Recently, I was doing some research for a new video when I stumbled upon this document which talks about Tartary in 1835, so I wanted to share it with you. The document itself on Google Books is attributed to William Pinnock. However, the title page indicates that this was adapted from Pinnock's work by a man called Edwin Williams. A comprehensive system of modern geography and history, revised and enlarged from the London edition of Pinnock's Modern Geography, and adapted to the use of academies and schools in the United States. William Pinnock was a British publisher and educational writer in the early 1800s who transitioned from schoolmaster to bookseller. In 1837, at the age of 35, he moved to London where he began publishing cheap educational works. Pinnock employed a style of teaching in the form of short manuals containing a series of questions and answers, like a modern-day examination, and this proved popular, as we can see by this adapted version for American schools provided by Edwin Williams. So this booklet would have likely been handed out in schools and academies across the United States after 1835, and it presents us a look at the educational syllabus of the time. A short perusal of the contents will give you an idea of what's contained, and if we turn to the preface, we can see a foreword by the author who praises William Pinnock for his services to education. Edwin Williams describes how he used Pinnock's geographical data combined within his book and combined it with the most prominent facts from history. So, we'll turn to the contents, and there are 4 topics we want to focus on: Tartary in general, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and also Asiatic Russia, because as we've discussed on this channel before, much of the land north of Mongolia and Manchuria was captured by the Russians in the 17th century. Before we delve in, there are a few things I'd like to bring your attention to. You'll notice these points are numbered, and that's because they correspond to a question which you can find at the end of each section. I've taken the liberty of bringing together a collection of the mentions of Tartary or Tartars in chronological order which appear in other sections of the book. After that, we'll examine the 4 topics I mentioned earlier. On page 21, when discussing the surface of the earth, we can see number 28 says, "The name of deserts is also given to fertile lands, which are uninhabited, as the desert of Ukraine in Poland, which lies along the river Dnieper. Most of the deserts of Tartary, represented so dreadful and barren, are of this kind. It would be more proper to name them wildernesses." This clears up a lot of confusion some people have when reading of these areas. For example, Tartaria Deserta, a name used to refer to sections around southwestern Siberia, was not an actual desert. On page 23, we can see it discussing the empires, where it says that the word for a Mughal or Tartar emperor is a Khan. On page 32, when speaking of the globe model, it says the Greeks passed it to the Romans and then they passed it to the Arabs, Persians, Turks and Tartars. Page 34, when speaking of maps, it claims again the Greeks passed them to the Arabs, Romans and Persians, who then shared them with the Turks and the Western Tartars, whilst the Eastern Tartars received their maps from China. Just below, it claims that maps were spoken of in China as early as 2,207 years before Christ. On page 70, when discussing the Pacific Ocean, it describes the Sea of Kamchatka as lying on the eastern shores of Siberia and Tartary. On page 239, we get to the section on Russia, where it tells us that the Russian Empire is the largest in the world, extending from the Baltic in the west to North America in the east, of which it now owns a portion, of course referring to Alaska. Below it provides a comparative view of the other empires active at the time, as well as ancient Persia, ancient Rome, and the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V. Russia is by far the largest active empire with 7 million square miles of land, and China is second with 3 million. The Chinese Empire, of course, including Tartary, with the rulers of China at this point being the Manchu Tartar dynasty. On page 242, we can see it describes the animals that inhabit the area around the Aral Sea. Horses, donkeys, antelopes and wolves, as well as a fierce animal called the Jolbart, which according to the Tartars was strong enough to carry off a horse. This is most likely describing the Caspian tiger, one of the largest big cats to grace the modern period, and was distributed across Central Asia from southern Russia to Afghanistan and the Caucasus to Xinjiang. The Caspian tiger was confirmed extinct in 2003. On page 244, they're describing Moscow and the different edifices of varying nations. The Pagoda of China, the Mosque of Constantinople, the cabaret of Spain, the gorgeous palaces of Greece and Rome, and interestingly, the Tartar temple of Bukhara, obviously referring to the type of architecture seen in Bukhara and Samarkand. It says the people of Moscow are as diverse as the buildings, with Tartars, Turks, Greeks, Cossacks, Poles, Germans, Chinese, English and French all seen parading in the habits of their respective countries. A breakdown of Russia's inhabitants shows that 89% of its population resides in Europe, with only 3.5% living in Siberia. Page 249 provides us the history of Russia, where it says Russia was little known to other European nations as an independent kingdom until the 15th century, before which it was frequently subject to the Tartars. The first ruler who bore the title Tsar was Ivan Vasilovich, known as Ivan the Great, who about the year 1481 succeeded in freeing Russia from the dominion of the Tartars, and it notes this is when the Cossacks first appear in history. Curiously, this document refers to him as Ivan I, whereas today he is known as Ivan III, and it also notes that he introduced the use of firearms. On the next page, we see it claims Poland was anciently inhabited by the Vandals, a Scythian tribe. They were dispossessed by the Tartars and Russians, who then went on to form several small states, united under Duke Lech in the year 550. On page 253, it discusses John Sobieski, who it calls the most distinguished king to ever rule Poland. In 1686, he assisted the Holy Roman Empire in defending the city of Vienna from the Tartar and Turk forces of the Ottomans. On page 271, we get to Germany, where it mentions that whilst the early history of the Germans was lost in fable, ancient authors called them either Celts, Scythians, or Celto-Scythians. A note at the bottom tells us, nearly all the countries of Europe are supposed to have been peopled by the Celts. The compilers of universal history are of the opinion that they are descended from Gomer, the eldest son of Japheth, who settled in Phrygia in Asia Minor, and also that the Celti took the left hand, spreading over Poland, Hungary, Germany, France and Spain, whilst the descendants of Magog, Gomer's brother, moved eastward and peopled Tartary. 2 pages later, and we can see it says that before the invasion of Augustus, nephew of Julius Caesar, Germany was peopled by barbarous hordes who wandered from place to place, much like the Tartars of the present day. The present day, of course, being in 1835. Page 398 begins the history of Turkey, where it tells us that after the fall of the Saracen Empire arose the Turks, a warlike people of Tartary whom the Saracens had called for aid, but were afterwards subdued by them. Number 3 here is the answer to the question, what is and has been Tartary? What was its ancient name? Tartary, more anciently called Scythia, has long been and still is the asylum of numerous wandering hordes or nations. From this inexhaustible reservoir of people issued all those numerous emigrations which so long proved the scourge of the rest of the earth. Question 4. What celebrated people came from Tartary, and from whom were they descended? From this country came the Avars, the Moguls, the Tartars and the Turks, all of whom deduce their origin from Japhet, the son of Noah. Question 5. What do the Tartars say is their proper name? Who was the first king of the Tartars? His son Turk, they say, was the first king or Khan of those nations now known by the separate names of Turks, Tartars and Moguls. And the Tartars especially assert that their proper designation is Turks. Question 6. What is attributed to Turk? Note, what gave rise to the 2 great empires of the Tartars and Moguls? To this Prince Turk is attributed many of those inventions which barbarous nations commonly ascribe to their first sovereign. Alanza Khan, a descendant of Turk, having 2 sons, Tartar and Mogul, divided his dominions between them, and thus gave rise to the 2 empires of the Tartars and the Moguls. Question 8. In what part dwelt the Tartarian nation to which the name of Turks has been more peculiarly given? The Tartarian nation to which the name of Turks has been peculiarly given dwelt between the Black and Caspian Seas, and became first known in the 7th century, when Heraclius, Emperor of the East, took them into his service, in which they so distinguished themselves by their bravery in the conquest of Persia that the Saracen or Arabian caliphs selected them for their armies. Question 18. By whom was Bayezid conquered, and what was his fate? Note, what were the chief conquests of Tamerlane? I must admit that note kind of gives away the answer, but Tamerlane, being provoked at the haughty insolence of Bayezid and penetrated with regret at the cruelties of the unfeeling tyrant, made war against him and gave him battle near Angora, on the same spot where Pompey had formerly defeated Mithridates. Tamerlane, one of the most celebrated kings of the Tartar nations, began his reign about the year 1370 and died at the age of 63 in 1405, during which period he conquered Persia, Turkestan, a great part of Russia, and also of Hindustan, sacked Aleppo, Baghdad and Damascus, and conquered the whole of Syria and Asia Minor. After taking Bayezid, the Emperor of the Turks, prisoner, he returned to Samarkand, the capital of the empire, and having projected an expedition against China, died on his march towards the country. Page 405, we get to Asia, and question 17 asks, what are the chief nations of Asia? The principal divisions or nations of Asia are Asiatic Russia, China, Japan, Hindustan, the Burman Empire, Afghanistan, Persia, Asiatic Turkey, Tartary, Siam, Cochin China, Tonquin Arabia, and the Isles. So we can see Tartary there quite clearly listed as one of the principal divisions or nations of Asia. Page 406, when talking of the divisions of Asiatic Turkey, it says this: it is divided into Eastern and Western. The eastern part comprehends Kurdistan, Al Jazeera, Iraq Arabi, Diyarbakir, and parts of Armenia. The western comprises Anatolia, or Asia Minor, Syria, and Palestine. There's a note at the bottom which says Georgia, which formerly belonged to Turkey, is now wholly in the possession of Russia, as well as a portion of Armenia. The country now called Turkomania is in Tartary. We now finally arrive at Asiatic Russia. Of course, before this area was known as Muscovite Tartary, Tartary belonging to the Muscovites. But by this point, it's become Asiatic Russia. And we've seen effectively all the mentions of the Tartars or Tartary in the other sections leading up to this point. This document doesn't go too deep on the history, but between 1533 and 1690 is essentially the time frame for this conquering of the East. So by the time this was released in 1835, Russia has solidified its control. Questions 1 through 5 are all essentially describing Asiatic Russia. How is it bounded? What's its length, breadth, population, chief mountains, rivers, and through what kind of country do the Russian rivers flow? It mentions Asiatic Russia, or Siberia, is a vast tract of country extending from European Russia to the Pacific Ocean, a distance of about 4,000 miles, and from the Arctic Ocean to the borders of China, Tartary, Persia, and Asiatic Turkey, an extent of about 2,000 miles. The population of this immense country is very small in proportion to its extent, not exceeding 7 million. They consist of various tribes differing from each other in appearance, manners, religion, and language. The principal mountains of Asiatic Russia are the Uralian in the west, Caucasus, Altai, and Nechinsk. But the face of the country, for the most part, like European Russia, tends to be level. The chief rivers are the Obi, the Yenisei, the Lena, and the Irtysh. Its chief lake is Baikal. And number 5 just discusses where these rivers move through, so we don't really need to talk about that. Number 6 says describe the inhabitants as they were formerly and are at present. Describe the Georgians and the Circassians. And 7 is when did Siberia first belong to or make a part of the Russian Empire? The inhabitants were formerly almost wholly wanderers, but the greater portion now reside in towns, villages, and settled habitations. In the western part, the Georgians and Circassians are a half-civilized people, resembling the Persians in their manner of living. No part of this extensive country belonged to Russia till about the middle of the 15th century, nor was it completely subdued and attached to Russia till it was conquered by Peter the Great and Catherine II in the early part of the 18th century. Question 8 says, what did the ancient Greeks and Romans consider this country to be before the time of Ptolemy? What opinion had the Greeks formed of it at the time when Ptolemy flourished in 140? What was the utmost extent of land they knew towards the east? The ancient Greeks and Romans extended their imaginary Scythian Ocean over the space occupied by Siberia. Ptolemy, who flourished in 140 and was better informed, says that a vast unknown region lay to the northeast of the Caspian Sea, but the utmost extent of ancient geography scarcely reached the Uralian Mountains. Question 9. Under what other general name is this country frequently comprised? The whole of Asiatic Russia, extending from Turkey, Persia, Hindustan, and China to the Arctic Ocean, is frequently comprised under the general name of Tartary. Question 10. When did the Tartars found a settlement on the banks of the Irtysh and the Obi? In the Middle Ages, travelers and among others Marco Polo heard the Tartars speak vaguely of a country which was rich in furs but covered with perpetual darkness. In 1228, the Tartars founded settlements on the banks of the Irtysh and Oby. Number 11. What do the Russians consider the natural boundary between Siberia and Russia and Europe? And number 12. How is it bounded? In looking over a description of the Russian Empire, inserted in the memoirs of the Petersburg Academy, we find that this learned body considered the Uralian Mountains both as naturally dividing the Russian dominion into two parts, and as fixing invariably the true boundaries of Siberia. Number 12 just talks about the boundaries of Siberia itself, which, again, we don't really need to go into. Questions 13 and 14 are just describing the surface of Siberia, as in land and what the geography is like, and 15 to 18 are covering the chief animals, where it says the Siberian wilds and forests are filled with a great variety of animals. The reindeer wanders over the whole northern waste from west to east and is of great value. The mountains of Caucasus on the west afford the urus or bison and the ibex. Large stags are found in the tracts around Lake Baikal on the east, and wild horses roam in herds over the steppes adjacent to Tartary. The bear, the wolf, and the fox are common in Siberia, as also are hares, squirrels, and beavers. The best sables are found in the neighborhood of Yakutsk and in Kamchatka. Number 19, for what is Siberia chiefly valuable, and for what does it serve? So remember, every time it says Siberia, really it is essentially just saying Tartary, because these were the most northern regions of Tartary. Siberia is chiefly valuable to Russia for its mines and furs. It also serves as a place of banishment for delinquents. Prisoners of state have also been sent there who have greatly contributed to civilize and improve the country. Agriculture has made but little progress. So Siberia, even 200 years ago, was still being used then for a place to banish delinquents and people that you didn't want to have to deal with. Question 20. Whence is the name of Siberia? When and where was Sibri founded? The general name of Siberia is derived from an ancient town named Sibri, which is said to have stood on the banks of the Irtysh near the city of Tobolsk, and to have been the residence of the former sovereigns of this part of Asia. Sibri was founded by the Tartars, so yes, of course, Sibri, sometimes known as Kashlik or Cyber on many of the older maps, that was the location of the original Tartar kings who ruled this area. That was destroyed in 1584 by the Muscovites. Question 21. How is Siberia divided? Siberia is divided into two great governments, that of Tobolsk in the west and Irkutsk in the east. Its chief towns are Tobolsk and Irkutsk. The next few questions are just describing Tobolsk, Astrakhan, Irkutsk, Kamchatka, and the mountains of Kamchatka, which, again, we don't really need to talk about. Question 30 asks us what are the chief nations of Asiatic Russia, and then asks us to describe them. The principal nations or tribes of Asiatic Russia are the Tartars, Ostyaks, Koryaks, and Samoides. The Tartars people the southern parts of Asiatic Russia, from the Crimea to the Irtysh. These are considered the most civilized and industrious of all the natives. They are in general of a tawny complexion, stout and well-made, robust and vigorous. The Mongol and Manchu Tartars are of a copper color, and in general short and ugly. These extend from the Irtysh to Kamchatka under the various names of Kalmucks, Buryats, Mongols or Moguls, Manchus and Tungusians or Tungusi. The polar race are of a small stature, deformed and tawny, with black and coarse hair, with little eyes. These extend along the Arctic Ocean and reckon about 500,000 inhabitants under the names of Ostyaks, Koryaks and Samoides, who are generally from 4 to 5 feet in height. From their habits of life, they are filthy and squalid in the extreme, and are sunk in gross superstition and idolatry. The Kamchadales are not less filthy and brutalized than the northern tribes just mentioned. The Laplanders in the north of Europe and the Eskimo in the northern parts of America are of the same race and very similar in their appearance, habits, and manners. What has been said therefore of Lapland may be referred to all the northern part of Asia. The Ostyaks inhabit the country chiefly about the river Oby, somewhat to the northward and southward of the latitude of 60 degrees. They are not much superior to the Samoides, although living to the south of them. The Ostyaks have no alphabet, nor can they count higher than 10. They are, says a Russian traveler, small and feeble. Their dress is made of skins and furs, and like the Samoides, they live by hunting and fishing. The country of the Samoides lies along the seacoasts in the northwest of Siberia. It is very barren, and the inhabitants live in a style which much resembles that of brutes, subsisting chiefly by their reindeer or by hunting. The Kamchadales, like the Samoides and Ostyaks, have also their winter and summer cabins, which are generally about 12 feet high and subsist chiefly on fish. They travel on a small carriage like the Laplanders and Samoides, but instead of the reindeer, they're drawn by dogs, which greatly resemble our shepherd's dog. In the north of Kamchatka, the cabins are subterranean. The cabins in Kamchatka are actually built underground, they're subterranean. So that's something I'd never heard of before, so very curious. In 1835, underground cabins in Kamchatka, and of course, the dogs pulling the sleds, much like we see in Alaska. Very interesting, underground cabins, and we've learned about the people who are in Siberia, the different types of Tartars and other people, because it wasn't just the Tartars, but of course they were called Tartars. They were all distinguished as Tartars, the Tartarians, the people that come from Tartary, but they were individual groups, like you say, some of them better at battle. The Mongols, definitely much better than the 4 to 5 feet tall ones in the northern coasts. So that's the end of Asiatic Russia, or Muscovite Tartary, Siberia, whatever you want to call it, and we're now going to move on to Tartary in general. Now we've come to Tartary in general, and we're going to examine the questions and the answers given. Question 1. What is Tartary? Describe it. Tartary is a country of vast extent in the middle of Asia, but thinly inhabited and little known. Its surface is in general mountainous, and its soil various, but not very fruitful, except in Great Baccaria, east of the Caspian Sea and towards the south. Question 2. What are the limits of Tartary in its most general sense, and what in its limited or restricted sense? The term and the limits of Tartary are very undefined. Tartary in its most extensive sense contains all that vast country of Asia which lies between the frozen ocean to the north and Persia, the kingdom of Kabul, Hindustan and China to the south, and includes a great variety of nations, to each of which is applied the general name of Tartars, but often with a particular one denoting its local situation. In its limited or more restricted sense, Tartary excludes all that part which goes under the general name of Siberia. The question 3 says what are comprised under the general head of Tartary, and question 4 is how otherwise considered. Under the general head of Tartary are comprised Russian Tartary, Chinese Tartary and Independent Tartary. A description of Russian Tartary is included in that of Asiatic Russia or Siberia. Chinese Tartary and Independent Tartary are described under separate heads. Tartary is sometimes considered under the 3 general heads of Eastern, Western and Independent Tartary. Question 5. By what general name were the different tribes who inhabit Eastern Tartary formerly known, and describe them? The different tribes which inhabit Eastern Tartary were formerly called Mongol or Mughal Tartars, a very warlike people who on the one hand conquered Hindustan under Genghis Khan, and on the other subdued China in the 13th century and reigned there for 100 years, till they were expelled in the year 1368. Question 6. How is Chinese Tartary divided? Chinese Tartary, which is separated from China by a great wall, is divided into 2 parts, the eastern and western. The greatest part of this country either belongs to the Emperor of China, is tributary to him, or is under his protection. Question 7. What countries does Independent Tartary include? Independent Tartary includes all the country between Chinese Tartary and the Caspian Sea, and contains Turkestan, Great Baccaria, Turkomania, Kharazm, and some others of a lesser note. Question 8 is what is Western Tartary, and question 9 says to describe the Tartars. We also have a note here which says what have you to remark upon the name of Tartar? Do the Tartars themselves spell their name the same as we do? What is the difference? Is it of any moment whether we call them Tartars or Tatars? What are your reasons for continuing to call them Tartars in preference to Tatars? Are any names of places spelt by the natives differently from what we spell them, and name them and the cause of this difference? Western Tartary includes the remainder, most or all of which has been conquered by the Russians. Tartars, in general, are a robust people with good constitutions and are capable of undergoing great fatigue. They are very dexterous in handling their sabers and shooting with the bow and arrow. We're now going to read this note. The true name of these people as used by themselves and other Oriental nations is Tatar, but this difference to us is by no means essential. Indeed, for the sake of pronunciation, it is better to write it Tartar, from our having been accustomed so to do. Were this the only varied instance in the spelling the names of places, it would be proper to write Tatar, but when there are many thousands of greater differences, it cannot be worth our notice. Thus, the country by us called Persia is by the natives called Iran, that which we call Tibet is by the Indians named Bhutan, by the Tartars Barantola, and by the Chinese Chang. The great peninsula facing China, which is named by the natives Kalikwa, is in the Chinese geography called Chalcian, in that of the Manchus or Eastern Tartars, Solgun Koran, and in ours, Korea. China itself is a name unknown to the Chinese, whose country is called in the systems of their own geography Chunghwa, or the Middle Kingdom. In those of the Manchu Tatars, Niku Kuran. By the Mughals, Kati. Hence the Persians and Arabs call it Kate, and the Russians Kitay. The great river passing through eastern Tartary and falling into the Gulf of Kamchatka is called by the Mongols who inhabit its banks Onan. By the Manchus, Sagali and Ula. By the Chinese, Heilongjiang. And by the Russians, the Amur. Question 10. To whom in part are the Tatars subject? Many of the different nations or tribes of Tartary are of the same, others of a different origin. Although a considerable portion of this country is called independent, the greater part of the inhabitants are now in a loose state of subjection, either to the Russian, Chinese, and Persian empires, or to the Kingdom of Kabul. Number 11 just asks for the population of Tartary, and it gives the population of independent Tartary at 8 million, but the answer says our information on the subject of the population is very vague. The amount cannot be ascertained, but the inhabitants are by no means in proportion to the extent of the country. Number 12. From whom did the Tatars originally descend? How are they divided? These people originally descend from the Scythians. They are now generally divided into three great powers. The first are those known by the name of Tatars, the second are the Kalmucks, and the third, the Mongols. These Tatars are again subdivided into different tribes or nations, which frequently receive their names from their chiefs. Question 13. Where reside the Tatars properly so called? The Tatars, properly so called, live chiefly to the west, north, and east of the Caspian Sea. The most considerable of these are the Uzbeks, formerly subject to Persia, but now for the most part independent. Question 14 and 15 asks where the Kalmucks are located. The Kalmucks, sometimes called Uluths, inhabit the larger half of what is called Western Tartary. Their country is situated to the northeast of the Caspian Sea. These people never cultivate the lands, but rove from place to place in search of pasture for their flocks. They are under the protection of the Russians. The Kalmucks are said to possess many good qualities which give them great superiority over the wandering Tatars, but the Kalmucks and Mongols were formerly considered one nation. Questions 16 and 17. Where are the Mongols? The Mongols inhabit the western part of Chinese Tartary. Their country is bounded on the north by Siberia, on the west by Independent Tartary, on the south by the Great Wall of China, and on the east by Manchuria, or Chinese Eastern Tartary. The Mongols were formerly a very celebrated nation, and their conquests at one period were the most rapid and extensive of any people upon record. Question 18 and the final question. What is the language of Tartary? The language of Tartary is very various, but the basis of all is the ancient Scythian. The Manchu, a tribe of Tatars who conquered China in the last century, speak a very copious language, but this differs greatly from that in use by the Mongols, there being scarcely any words alike in the two languages. The Manchus consider their language the most copious in the world. So that was the final question for Tartary in general, and next we'll be moving on to Independent Tartary. Question 1, 2 and 3 are: describe Independent Tartary, how is it divided, which is the most interesting part, and describe that. Independent Tartary is a country of great extent. It is bounded on the north by the country of the Kalmucks and Russia, on the east by Chinese Tartary, on the south by Persia and Kabul, and on the west by the Caspian Sea. It is divided into 5 great parts, namely Bukharia, Turkomania, Turkestan, Balkh, Kharizm, and the country of the Kyrgyz. But the most interesting part is Great Bukharia. Great Bukharia comprises the south part of Independent Tartary. It is in general fruitful and populous, and inhabited by an active and very industrious people. Why is it called Great Bukharia? And question 5, of what was this country formerly the cradle and seat? This country is about 700 miles in length and 350 in breadth. It is called Great Bukharia to distinguish it from Little Bukharia in Chinese Tartary, which is but little known. Great Bukharia was the cradle and seat of the ancient Persian monarchy, and for a long period continued as a portion of that empire. It was also the native place of the famous Zoroaster, the famous Persian legislator. Question 6, which is the most fertile part of Tartary? And question 7, describe it, with question 8 being describe Turkestan. The most fertile part of all of Independent Tartary is Olsog, so named from the river that flows through it. For 8 days, says Hawkel, we may travel in the country of Sog, and not be out of one delicious garden. On every side are villages, rich cornfields, fruitful orchards, beautiful gardens, and rich meadows, intersected by numerous rivulets and canals, altogether presenting a most lively picture of industry and happiness. Turkestan, formerly a province of considerable extent, is now represented as a small country, watered by the river Karaso, which falls into the Sire or Sur. Question 9 asks what are its chief towns, and what was the capital of the Turks? Question 10 asks what events occurred here in the first centuries of the Christian era. And question 11, what do Mela and Pliny observe of these nations? Turkestan lies between Lake Aral on the west and the country of the Kalmucks on the east. Its chief towns are Taraz, Otra, Turkestan and Tashkent, situated on the banks of the Sire, containing about 30,000 inhabitants. The capital of the Turks was at one time Taraz and afterwards Otra. Here it was in the first centuries of the Christian era that the Turks, descending from the Altaic mountains, established the center of their abode and gave to their country the name of Turkestan, from which they departed to make the conquest of the southwest part of Asia and of Greece. According to Pomponius Mela and Pliny, all the nations whom we denominate Tartars acknowledge the appellation of Turks as belonging to them in common. Question 12. Describe Turkomania. And question 13, in what manner do the inhabitants of Turkomania and Tartary generally live? Turkomania is a considerable province of Independent Tartary, lying between the Caspian Sea and Lake Aral. It is said to be populous, but for the most part a sandy and rocky country, laboring under a great deficiency of water. These people live chiefly in tents or in caves among the rocks. They keep great numbers of camels, cattle and sheep, and like the Kyrgyz, they lead a wandering life. Question 14. Describe Karazm. Karazm is bounded on the north by Turkomania, east by Bukharia, south by Khorasan, and west by the Caspian Sea. Its chief town is Khiva, containing about 10,000 inhabitants. Question 15 to 18 asks about Balkh and to whom does it belong. Balkh, a province lying south of Bukharia, anciently formed a part of Bactriana. This country is now subject to the Afghans or the Kingdom of Kabul. Its capital is of the same name and is one of the most famous cities of the East. It is the Bactria of the Greeks and is said to be as large as Delhi, but the greater part of the houses are uninhabited. This city was for a long period the capital of the ancient kings of Persia. Balkh was formerly included in the Kingdom of Khorasan. This country is chiefly inhabited by Uzbeks, Afghans and Tanjets, who for the most part roam with their flocks in search of pasturage. The Uzbeks are simple, honest and humane, but the Afghans and Tanjets are said to be corrupt and dissolute. Question 19 asks us to describe the country of the Kyrgyz, and 20 asks how these people are divided. The country of the Kyrgyz comprises the northern part of Independent Tartary and part of Russian Tartary, being an extensive tract to the north of the Caspian Sea and Aral Lake. These people are divided into three hordes, namely the Greater, the Middle and Lesser Horde. They are of Tartarian origin and are distinguished by their features and manners of that race. They are supposed to amount to about 1 million. Of the country occupied by the Kyrgyz, the Russians in their maps include the whole within the limits of their empire, though their sovereignty is merely nominal. Question 22 asks how do they live, and 23 asks about their religion. The Kyrgyz dwell in tents, which they carry with them in their migrations from the banks of the Sir to the steppe of Isim. Their flocks and herds are very numerous, and some individuals among them possess a great share of pastoral wealth. Each horde is governed by a Khan, or prince of its own. Their religion is Mahamatism, intermixed with idolatrous superstition. They have no towns of their own, but for the purposes of traffic they frequent the towns of Siberia and those bordering on the Sir. Question 24. What are the chief cities of Independent Tartary? The chief cities of Independent Tartary are Samarkand, the celebrated capital of Tamerlane, Bukhara, which was often its rival, and Balkh, the emporium of the productions of India, but the latter is now included in the Kingdom of Kabul, as shown hereafter. For more information, see Afghanistan. Questions 25, 26, 27 and 28 asks us to describe what is said of Samarkand, Bukhara and Bukharia. Samarkand was the ancient Marakanda, where Alexander the Great, in a fit of intoxication, killed Cletus, who had saved his life at the Battle of Granicus. It was also the birthplace of Tamerlane. This city was taken by Genghis Khan in 1220. It was long distinguished throughout the East as a seat of learning and possessed the most famous of the Mahometan universities. Bukhara was a city of great extent. The number of houses is said to exceed 120,000, and there are as many in the suburbs. Allowing about 4 inhabitants to one house, it will make the number amount to 960,000. Bukhara was known to the Greeks and Romans by the names of Bactriana and Sogdiana, and was for some time the seat of a Grecian kingdom. Question 29 asks what great events occurred here in the time of Alexander. It was upon the borders of the rivers Seir and Oxus towards the north, near the Lake Aral, that Alexander's course was stopped, amid the arid desert of Sogdiana, where no verdure nor streams were seen, being alike fearful to pause or proceed, till the evening sun pointed out the river Oxus in the vale below. Question 30. What is said of Genghis Khan? It was here that Genghis Khan in the 13th century met a rival in Muhammad, king of Khwarezm, who was bold enough to give him battle at Otrar and counterbalance his fate by checking his hitherto rapid career. Genghis proved the conqueror, and this victory extended his power to the Euphrates and to the very heart of India. 31. What is said of Tamerlane and Nadir Shah? Tamerlane made it his principal residence and seat of royalty. Here the ambassadors of all the sovereigns of the world came to pay their respects to the chief of the Moguls. Later still, it was the theatre of the exploits of Nadir Shah, who glorified in having been one of its natives. 32 and 33 asks us what occurred with Sultan Babur. A descendant of Timur, Sultan Babur was expelled in the year 1494 by the Uzbek Tartars, who established a powerful monarchy in Bukharia. Sultan Babur, immediately on being driven from Bukharia, with his Mughals penetrated into Hindustan, where he founded the Mughal Empire. Question 34. Who holds possession of Bukharia, and how is it divided? The Uzbek Tartars still possess Bukharia, which is now divided into districts and sub-districts, under officers appointed by the sovereign, who collect the revenue and dispense justice. The king of Bukharia's title is Commander of the Faithful. Question 35 and 36. What is said of the population of Bukharia, and what is the religion and government? The population of Bukharia consists chiefly of Uzbeks and Bukharians. The former live after their Tartarian manner, dwelling in tents in the summer and in towns and villages in the winter. The latter inhabit towns and cultivate the land. The religion of both is Mahometan, the government despotic. Now, in the question section, we do actually seem to be missing questions 37 and 38, but they generally seem to be about Bukharia. Bukharia is the medium of commerce between Persia, Kabul, Hindustan, China, and Russia, but it is little known to Europeans. The geography of this country is too little explored to lay down with accuracy the ranges of mountains which traverse it in different directions. Question 39. Where is the ancient Mount Imau, now called Bela Tag? On the east of Great Bukharia is a great ridge running north and south under the name of Bela Tag, the ancient Imau. This ridge unites on the south with the Hindu Kush and the Ghor Mountains, which, running east and west, divide Bukharia from Hindustan, Kabul, and Persia. These mountains are covered with perpetual snow. Question 40 asks what are the chief rivers of Independent Tartary and their ancient names? The principal rivers of Independent Tartary are the Amu and the Seir. The Oriental geographers called the Amu Jehun and the Seir Sihun. The Jehun takes its rise in the Belo Mountains, joins the river from Balkh and falls into the Lake Aral, though formerly it ran into the Caspian Sea, its course having been changed by the Tartars. It is about 900 miles in length. The Seir Sash or Sihun also rises in the Bela Mountains, passes by Otrar, and after a course of about 550 miles, falls into Lake Aral. Its chief lake is that of Aral, which signifies the Sea of Eagles. And finally, questions 43 and 44. What is the climate? The climate of Independent Tartary in general is very healthy, but although lying in the parallel of Spain, Greece and Asiatic Turkey, both summer and winter are much colder, and in the north part, the winters sometimes are extremely severe. This moderated heat in summer and severity of cold in winter are caused by the proximity of the deserts of Siberia and of the mountains of Tibet, which are covered with perpetual snow. So after scrolling past the Chinese Empire and looking through that, we come to Chinese Tartary, where we get some information about that. So the first 7 questions are part of the same one. It's describe Chinese Tartary, how is it bounded, what are its chief nations, describe them, when did the Manchu Tartars conquer China, and what dynasty now reigns in China. This extensive portion of Asia has frequently sent forth its hordes to overrun the different states of Europe and Asia. It is bounded on the north by Asiatic Russia or Siberia, on the east by the Sea of Japan, on the south by China proper and Tibet, and on the west by Independent Tartary. Chinese Tartary is divided according to the different tribes by which it is inhabited. The eastern part is occupied by the Manchus, the middle by the Mongols, and the west by the Kalmucks and Songars. The inhabitants of Chinese Tartary are, in general, a very uncivilized people. The Manchus conquered China in the year 1644 and took possession of the throne, which is still held by the Tartar dynasty. The greater part of this vast country is an immense plain and is by far the most elevated level on the face of the globe. It is usually known by the name of the Great Plain of Asia. It is intersected by barren rocks and vast sandy deserts, and it is supported on all sides by lofty mountains, whose elevated summits determine the different climates of the great continent of Asia and form the division of its waters. From its exterior flow all the great rivers of that part of the world. In the interior are many rivers having little declivity or no issue, which are lost in the sands or feed stagnant waters. Question 8 asks us what celebrated people came from Chinese Tartary that committed so much devastation in the Middle Ages. And this question is so large that it's actually dedicated to 8, 9, and 10. It was from the northern parts of this plain, which is now occupied by the Songars, the Kalmucks and Mongols, that those Tartars poured forth who in the Middle Ages covered the earth with calamities, namely the Huns, Avars, Moguls or Mongols, and the Turks. The people to the north of the plain are shepherds and wanderers. Their riches consist in their herds, their habitations are tents, and their towns camps, which are transplanted according to their want of pasturage for their cattle. The whole of this country acknowledges the Chinese scepter, which subdued the Mongols towards the end of the 17th century, the Kalmucks, the Songars and Little Bukharia in 1759, and lastly Tibet in 1780. Question 11 asks, what mountains form the western boundary of Chinese Tartary? The western boundary of this great plain are the mountains of Bela Tag, the Yimou of the ancients, and on the north it has the Great Altayan chain. Questions 12 to 14 describe the Tartars and their mode of living. The Chinese and the Tartars have so strong a personal resemblance as to induce the presumption that they had the same origin. The most remarkable difference arises from a total disparity in their dispositions, manners and customs. The Tartars are fierce, warlike and fond of hunting. They love fatigue and independence, but the manners of the Chinese are the reverse. They are effeminate, superstitious, submissive, and very ceremonious. In every age, these immense plains have been inhabited by wandering tribes of hunters and shepherds, whose indolence refuses to cultivate the earth, and whose restless, enterprising spirit disdains the confinement of a sedentary life. Question 15 asks what part of this country comprised Scythia beyond Imau? A small portion of the western part of Chinese Tartary seems to have been included in what the ancients called Scythia beyond Imau. Question 16 asks what did the ancient Serica comprise? And 17, which part is occupied by the Kalmucks, which by the Mongols, and which by the Manchus? This again takes up more questions than it seems, and it fills up from 16 to 25. The Serica of the ancients appears to have included the western parts of Tibet, Kashmir, Little Tibet, and a part of Little Bukharia. The Kalmucks may be considered as the Western Mongols. They are supposed to amount about 1 million. Their country comes in contact with China on the east and Independent Tartary on the west. It is bounded on the north by Siberia and on the south by Tibet. Its surface is equal to the whole of France, Italy and Spain. Their latitudes are the same, but their climate and productions are very different. The dwellings of the Kalmucks are tents made of hurdles, covered over with a roof of felt, which is proof against rain and snow. These people prefer their wandering state and their portable dwellings to all the convenience of a settled life. The language of the Kalmucks is the same with that of the Mongols, but very different from that of the Tartars. The religion of the Kalmucks, like that of the Mongols, Manchus and Tibetan nations, is that of the Grand Lama. Although this part of Tartary is distinguished by the appellation of Chinese, its relation to that empire is in many parts, especially to the west and north, very lax and precarious, and some of the Tartar tribes within these bounds might, without impropriety, be ranked among the independent. Among the great natural features of this country may be mentioned the wide deserts of Gobi and Shimo. The former on the borders of Tibet, the latter on China, both destitute of water and plants and only to be crossed like those of Arabia by camel. The two leading divisions of the inhabitants of Chinese Tartary are the Mongols and Manchus. The former possessed the greatest extent of territory and are subdivided into the principal tribes of the Kalmucks, Iluts and Khalkhus, which frequently go under the general name of Kalmucks, already noticed. Question 26 to 34 asks us to describe the Mongols and the Manchus. The Mongols are also a wandering people, subsisting almost entirely on the products of their flocks and herds, which they lead to pasture in different parts of their wide territory, according to the season and state of forage. Their domestic animals are horses, camels, oxen, sheep and goats. They dwell in tents of felt and use covered wagons for the conveyance of their families from place to place. The men are employed in hunting and sometimes in predatory expeditions. The women make all the household furniture and clothing and prepare the food. The Mongols are said to be of a very cheerful temper and their general character kind, frank and hospitable. They are fond of amusements, which consist chiefly of feats of strength and activity, music and dancing. Their migrations appear like parties of pleasure, and no people are so little molested with cares and anxiety. It is not therefore to be wondered at that they prefer their own mode of life to the settled abode of the cultivators of the land and the inhabitants of towns, and cannot easily be induced to change it. Manchuria comprises the eastern part of Chinese Tartary. The Manchus are a branch of the Mongol Tartars and do not greatly differ from them in character and appearance, but more of them have fixed habitations and are also in a higher state of civilization in consequence of their intimate connection with the Chinese emperors, who are of their race. The Manchus are said to have neither temples nor idols, but to worship one supreme being. Their language is deemed to be the most perfect of the Tartarian tongues. The Hoanko traverses the southern part of Mongolia. The river Amur, which in the early part of its course is called the Onan, also rises in Mongolia and passes through the country of the Manchus. That part of the Manchu territory which lies between the Great Wall of China and the river Amur appears to be well inhabited and embraces a great number of towns and villages. Its capital is Sagalian. So that's the end of the sections we wanted to view, and it's given us a valuable glimpse into the curriculum and taught history of 1835. Between then and now, Tartary has faded into obscurity. Independent Tartary was invaded by Russia in the mid to late 1800s, not long after this document was written. You can learn more about that in my Tartaria in the News series, and I'll be making a more in-depth video on that topic soon. Chinese Tartary also lost territory to Russia as a result of the Second Opium War, signing the Treaty of Aigan in 1858, which ceded lands up to the Amur River, and then the Convention of Pekin in 1860, signed at the end of the war, saw Russia take the east coast of Manchuria. Over the next 30 years, Manchuria was slowly Russified as the Chinese Eastern Railway was constructed by the Russians, using Tatar slaves as their workforce. Manchuria then went on to see multiple battles fought over it with the Japanese, with that continuing on and off until the conclusions of the Second World War. The borders between what is now China and Russia have stayed essentially the same since 1860, with some minor changes here and there to settle the odd dispute. Meanwhile, the regions that constituted Independent Tartary finally saw independence once more at the fall of the Soviet Union on December 25, 1991. However, lands in Siberia such as the Sakha Republic, once known as Yakutia, Buryatia, located around Lake Baikal, and the areas east of the Ural Mountains, which once made up the Cyber Khanate, still remain under Russian control. How might this continent look if these people remember their history? If they decided they are sick of being dictated to by a city thousands of miles to the west? Tired of their sons and daughters being sent into foreign wars that do not concern them? Then perhaps we'd see Russia return to its pre-1584 borders, contained behind the Ural Mountains. Perhaps it would go even further, with the Tatars of Kazan and Astrakhan demanding their own freedom, and in that case, we'd see Russia shrink to the borders of 1533. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you'd like to support me, then there's a lot of ways you can do so. My preferred method is the Patreon, which will give you exclusive access to my members' Discord, where I hang out all day and I share my research. If you're already a supporter, then thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Making these videos is essentially a full-time job, and aside from the small advertisement money that I get, I obviously don't get paid. So your support really does keep me going, and I can't thank you enough. So I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Ancient Historia.